All right, we're ready for chapters 16 and 17 in our survey through the New Testament. This is the list of the ministries of Jesus, and each time we plug in Matthew, we'll plug in other books as we go along, and other books. But we are in the Galilean ministry. Now, we'll get through with the Galilean ministry in our study next time. That's chapter 18. We're at 16 and 17 today. 18 will wind that up. This is our outline that we're following. We're in the Galilean ministry, as again, we're going to finish that up next time. We're in the section of what the people thought, and we hope to have time at the end to kind of give a summary of that, of what we see in chapter 16 and 17 that mimics or at least illustrates what's previous to that. And then we're ready for the Judean ministry in 2 weeks. So let's review our chapters of where we've been. Chapter 1 was... All right, very good. Chapter 2, the wise men and the massacre of the children. Visit of the wise men. Chapter 3, it's about baptism. What about baptism? Yeah, two things about baptism. There's John who baptized, and then there's the baptism of Jesus. Chapter 4. Temptation. And that's where, very good. And where does it end? Chapter 18. Very good. All right. Chapters 5 through deal with Sermon on the Mount. Chapters 8 and 9 we group together dealing with miracles and discipleship. We see both of those in our study today. Chapter 10. Apostles were chosen and they were sent out on the limited commission. Chapter 11. All right, John sends messengers and there's the invitation at the end. Chapter 12. They do the same thing in chapter 16 today. And then chapter 13 ought to stand out in our mind because it's not the only place parables are found, but it's full of parables. Chapter 14. All right, more miracles, but John was beheaded. And then chapter 15 last time. And more miracles, yes. Here the Pharisees find fault. All right, let's get underway with chapter 16 now. Question number, I've done lost my questions. I think it's number 1. What's chapter 16 about? All right. The Pharisees question Jesus and they find fault with him. Later in the chapter, we have Peter's confession. And that's what I entitled the chapter because that's what stands out in the chapter in my mind. But we'll say more about that in a moment. 2 things happen in chapter 16. We have the opposition of the Pharisees and Sadducees, and then we have who Jesus is and what it means. And we'll thread all of this together because I think there is a predominant thought running through this chapter and on into chapter 17. All right, let's talk about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They come and they are together. Now that's quite a strange connection because they're not friends. They're enemies, in fact. They disagreed over a fundamental Bible doctrine, a very major Bible doctrine, which was resurrection. And so this was not a minor disagreement that they had some fine-tuning, but they generally were the same. There's major doctrinal differences. And yet they together come and question Jesus. One commentator says it's like dogs that fight and are enemies, but together they run and chase after a rabbit that's a worse enemy than each one of them. And so that's what they're doing with Jesus. Yeah, they hate each other, but there's one common enemy they have, and that's the Lord. So let's work together in opposing the Lord. So here's what they do. They come asking for a sign from heaven. And what was Jesus' answer to that? All right, he calls them hypocrites. He said, you're able to discern other things. You can look to the sky and you can see it's red and you conclude from that the weather's going to be fair. And he said, you can look to the sky and you see that it's red and threatening and you say, well, it's going to be foul weather today. I mean, that's basically what we do. We look to the sky and you say, the sun is bright and there's not a cloud in the sky. We're going to have a good day. We're not going to have any rain. You look and there's a dark cloud in the sky. It's probably going to rain. And so the point he's making is you are able to look and draw conclusions. You're able to look at the evidence and from that evidence draw the proper conclusion, and yet you're not looking at the evidence concerning the Messiah and drawing the proper conclusion. You can't see the obvious. You can reason and infer and draw conclusions when it comes to the weather, but you can't reason and infer and draw conclusions when it comes to miracles. You're not willing to do that. You're a hypocrite. You're honest over here, but you're being dishonest over there. Does that make sense? Now there's a lesson to be learned. God does not always spell everything out, meaning by that, to look to the sky, you don't see a sign that says it's going to rain today. You're looking at evidence and drawing that conclusion, aren't you? And there are some people, even members of the church, who can't take a text and draw a conclusion unless the text specifically says that. Perhaps what broke us on that or got us in the wrong mode are some of the workbooks years ago that you filled in the blank that Jesus traveled to what city, and you have to fill that in because it's specifically mentioned. We need to learn to take the text and draw conclusions from the text. Does that make sense? That's what God intended for us to do. Now, he calls them a wicked and adulterous generation. That does not mean they are committing immoral acts of adultery, but it's a spiritual adultery in the sense that they are turning their back on God and going after the concepts of men and listening to the doctrines of men. That's spiritual adultery. We could do the same thing today, and we become a wicked and adulterous generation. Make sense? He said, you do that, but there will be no sign given but that of the prophet Jonah. Does that mean he's not going to give any miracles? No, he's already supplied miracles, has he not? We saw that in chapters 8, chapter 9, in nearly every chapter we've come to. He's going to give even more in this context. We'll come to chapter 17. There's be more. There's more healing. There's more evidence. We saw last week there's the walking on the water, et cetera, et cetera. And what does he mean there shall be no sign given but that of the prophet Jonah? All right, yes. That's the ultimate sign and the ultimate conclusion. That's not the only sign. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying, here is the only evidence that will ever be presented, but that's the only other sign that I guarantee you're going to see, and consequently, he's not going to just work a miracle just because they ask. Because they've already seen evidence. It's much like citing passages that somebody said, where does the Bible teach baptism is essential? And you cite 4 or 5 passages, but where is the passage? Do you need to cite a 6th or 7th? No. Just walk off, because if they're not accepting that, they'll not accept the other 10 that you might cite. Make sense? All right. Now then, let's come to verses 5 through 12, and Jesus warns of their doctrine. Now that's not just shifting gears, it's in that context where they're actually teaching a doctrine that says he's not the Son of God. These miracles do not prove that. So Jesus warns of the doctrine of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees. So when they went to the text says that when his disciples had come to the other side. Now, that is when they came to Bethsaida. Now notice back in chapter 15 and 39 they'd been at Magdala. And so if you take a look right here, this is where they are. Now they're going to the other side, and by the other side they're coming over here near Bethsaida. And then he's going to be headed up here to Caesarea Philippi here in just a minute. But that's where they're headed. And so they go to the other side, and the disciples had forgotten something. They forgot to take their food with them. And Jesus warned them, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now the parallel account adds, and Herod. Now that's interesting. And there's a textual question about that, whether Herod's supposed to be there, and I'll leave that till we get to Mark. I'm not going to delve into that, but let's just assume it's there. That he's warning of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees and of Herod. And that is those who reject and do not accept the evidence. And they thought, they're talking about having no bread. And so he said, he rebukes their little faith, and he said, why do you reason among yourselves? Now notice at verse 9, Do you remember the 5 loaves and the 5,000 and how many baskets you took up? Mark's account says he asked them how many baskets they took up, and they answered. They remembered. Then he asked them about the 4,000 and how many baskets were taken up, and Mark's account said they remembered and they answered. They hadn't forgot that. And so he said, do you not remember that? What were they to draw? Remember, we talked about drawing conclusion. What conclusion should they have drawn from those events? Other than he is the Son of God.
They don't have to worry about material things such as food or nothing like that. That would be provided.
Yeah, that if I was really talking about literal bread, have you forgotten that I can take the 2 fish and five loaves and turn it in and feed 5,000, have fragments left over? This is not a problem. You've forgotten what I was able to do. So now notice at verse 11 and 12, what's he talking about? He said, I'm not talking about, I'm paraphrasing, the leaven of bread. Yeah, he's talking about the doctrine of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees. Now let's go to question number 3. Why is the doctrine of the Pharisees referred to as leaven? Make some application of the principle to present day. Why didn't he just say, beware of the false teaching of this group of Pharisees and Sadducees? He could have said that, and we would not have been surprised. But he calls it the leaven. Why does he call it that?
Because the small amount is what gets blown up. So like the little bit false information that they're giving, people start to question it, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Like each next time you sprinkle a little bit of falsehood, and then it's like, ooh, I wonder if that's, and then it gets bigger and bigger.
All right, very good. It has this permeating effect. Just a little leaven leavens the whole lump, 1 Corinthians 5, remember that? And so it has this permeating effect. It spreads. It is a corrupting influence. And so this being tolerated, that leads to another false doctrine, which then begins to spread. And just like sin in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Any other comments on question number 3? Our influence for evil does the same way. 1 Corinthians 5, 1 Corinthians 15, other texts. But 1 Corinthians 15 is in 1 Corinthians 15:33 that evil communications corrupts good manners. That was in the context of false teaching, by the way. That's what it was specifically talking about. All right. Now let's talk about Peter's confession. Now, interesting now, and I want you to get this picture that you got the Pharisees questioning and doubting who he is. We haven't seen enough evidence yet. We are rejecting the evidence. And so Jesus warns, don't listen to this permeating effect of this false teaching. But what I'm interested in, Jesus is saying to his disciples, is do you understand and is the world understanding who I really am? Because he's about to shift gears. Don't forget that. I'll flag the passage in a moment that you need to mark. He's about to shift focus in a moment. Before he does that, I want to know if you understand who I am. So he's asked the question, and this takes place in the region of Caesarea Philippi. Well, all right, so they've come across from Magdala to Bethsaida, and on up here, they're in the region of Caesarea Philippi. We'll say more about that region in a moment. And so he asked this question, who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And their answer was John the Baptist, because remember Herod had circulated that idea. Some said he was Jeremiah. Some of the rabbis taught Jeremiah was going to be raised from the dead and come back. Some said the same thing about Elijah, perhaps a perversion of the prophecy of John the Baptist coming in the spirit and the power of Elijah. We'll say more about that in a second. And then some said that he was one of the great prophets. And then he asked, who do you say that I am? And Peter's answer was, all right, they understood. He understood. He said, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed it, but my Father which is in heaven. Now, here's some practical things we learn quickly. I learned from that context, men can be wrong. Men were wrong. Because men were saying, oh, he's John the Baptist. Well-educated men can be wrong. I learned that Peter was right. Why was Peter right? Was it because he was an apostle? No. Jesus just told us. Say again? He understands the evidence. Look at verse 17. For flesh and blood has not revealed it, but my Father which is in heaven. He's right because he agreed with the revelation of God. You see, if what I teach is right, it's not right because I'm Donnie Rader. It's not right because I'm a preacher. It's not right because I'm an elder in the church. It's right because it agrees with the revelation of God. Make sense? All right, very practical stuff. Now, in verse 18, he said, you are Peter. That's a play on a stone. His name means stone. But on this rock, not the same word. What's the rock refer to? Not to Peter. The foundation, which is the fact that he is the Son of God, what has just been acknowledged. On this principle, if he weren't the Son of God, it would make no difference what he built. I wouldn't care what he built. But he said, on this principle that I am the Son of God, I will build my church. Now, you might want to flag that this is the first time the term church has been used in the New Testament. The first time it's been used. Every prophecy thus far has been a reference to the coming of the kingdom. The whole Sermon on the Mount was about the kingdom. Now, it's not saying the church and the kingdom are not the same. They are the same. I mean, we're going to see that in this context. But this is the first time. The only other time it's going to be used is next week in chapter 18. Tell it to the church. Won't be used again in the book of Matthew. Good point. Good point. I will build my church. And the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Now, there are various explanations of the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Pope goes in his commentary on numerous pages giving a little more convoluted explanation that I don't necessarily buy into, that it has to do more with that the fight the kingdom of God is making against the gates of Hades. I take it that in context, he's going to mention it, verse 21, about his death. And when he died, his spirit went into the Hadean realm. Psalm 16 said so. And the fact that he dies is not going to prevent him from establishing his kingdom. That's what I take it to mean. That, in other words, I'm going to build my church, and before it's established, he's going to end up being killed, and the disciples are going to think, oh my, he said he's going to build his church. What? Oh no, I can't imagine. He's not going to get it done. No, the gates of Hades are not going to prevent it from happening. And how do we know? Well, he's going to say at verse 21 that he's going to be raised. Makes sense? All right. Now notice at verse 19, I'll give you the keys of the kingdom. The term kingdom is used interchangeably with the church. You say, how do you know it's used interchangeably? What he's going to build, I'm going to give you the terms of entrance to. And I often illustrate, I'm going to build a house and I'll give you the keys to my dwelling. The house and the dwelling are one and the same. Doesn't make sense. I'm going to build one thing, but I'm going to give you the keys and the terms of entrance to something entirely different from that. And so it is one and the same. All right. Then he commanded the disciples not to tell anyone, and perhaps that's in light of John 6, which is parallel about the same time. There was an effort to try to seize him and make him king. If that were to happen, to make him some kind of earthly king or honor him or recognize him as an earthly king, that would have prevented his real mission, which was he was to die. And so if there was this earthly kingdom somehow that man tries to form and make him king, they might have tried to offset that effort. And so don't tell anyone what's going on. Now then, let's get to verse 21. Jesus tells of his death and his resurrection. You might underline, from that time. There's the transition I said we'd flag. From that time, he began to show his disciples he goes to Jerusalem and that he would be killed and raised the third day. Prior to this point, his focus has been in his Galilean ministry. From this point, though he still has work in Galilee to do and in Perea, his focus is going to Jerusalem and dying and being raised. Does that make sense? There's his focus. From that time, this is a transition point. So we just saw a transition point. We just changed If you were there with Jesus, you'd have to acknowledge something's different now. He's turned his focus, not to teaching the multitudes here. He's headed toward Jerusalem. And he talks about what, though they don't seem to understand that. Now, at verse 22 and 23, what did Peter say? Yeah, it ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen. In other words, they're not going to kill you. And this shall not happen. And he said, get you behind me, Satan. In other words, you're listening more to Satan. But I want you to pay attention to two things. You are an offense to me. English Standard said, you are a hindrance to me. New Century translates that, you're not helping me. Sometimes in our best efforts, where we think we're doing the Lord a favor, the Lord is saying to us, you're not helping me here. Does that make sense? You're actually hindering me. Now pay attention to verse 23 because we're about to pay attention to what it means. For you're not mindful of the things of God. You're not thinking about the things of God. You're thinking about the things of men. That brings us to this next section. This is about the cost of discipleship, which really, what this section is focusing on, this is what's involved in being mindful of God. This is why this follows. It's not just, oh, by the way, now we're through with Peter. Let's talk about cost of discipleship. You're saying, Peter, you're not going to let it happen. You need to be mindful of God. This will make a sermon within itself. Notice 5 things here. What's involved? Being mindful of God means you deny yourself. Peter's thinking about himself here. Does that make sense? Peter's thinking about self. And so he said, what you need to do is deny yourself. You need to be willing to bear the burden. Take your cross. A cross is a burden. Thirdly, look at verse 25 and 26. Value spiritual life over physical life. A man who saves his life will lose it, lose his life will save it. Value spiritual life over physical life. That's minding the things of God. Verse 27, value the temporal over, the eternal over the temporal. Look at verse 27. That when he comes with his angels, then he will reward each one according to his works. That's focused on the eternal. Peter, you're not focusing on the eternal, you're focusing on the here and the now. And then last of all, value being in the kingdom of God. There's some standing here which will not taste death until they see the kingdom come. You're not valuing being in the kingdom. Does that make sense? That'd make a good sermon right there. 5 points involved in being mindful of God. I think verses 24 to 28 is an explanation of what it means to be mindful of God, verse 23. Does that make sense? Up and down chest, back and forth no. 2 hands in the air say, I'm confused, let's start over. Say again? It is. Very costly. Make sense? All right, let's move on. Now, at verse 24 beginning, or not verse 24, I'm ready to go to verse 1 of chapter 17. Do you see how chapter 16, though, flows from the standpoint, here's what the Pharisees are thinking. Beware of the influence they have. Don't be influenced by them. Who do you think? Do you understand who I am? And if you do, the church is going to be built on that principle. And I'm going to Jerusalem to accomplish this. And y'all got to be with me and mind the things of God if you're going to be of any value. Make sense? All right, chapter 17 deals with the transfiguration. That's not all that's there, but that's the major event. In verses 1 to 13, and then verses 14 to 21 will be the healing of the epileptic son. Then we're going to come back to his telling of his death and resurrection. Focus there, and so let's get underway. Where does this take place? He went to the Mount of Transfiguration. There are 3 areas, 3 locations that are thought possibly to be the case. I want to think that it's probably Mount Hermon. And one of the evidences of that, the last scene is he's in Caesarea Philippi. Mount Hermon is there. Cal Pope in his commentary, at which I'm leaning on suggests that Mount Hermon is the most logical place for it. Tradition, though, says it's down here at Mount Tabor, which means he had to come from Caesarea Philippi and make his way all the way back down. I'm not convinced of that. Mount Meron is a third alternative, some think. I'm not seeing the evidence of that. I want to lean toward Mount Hermon. It's not a big deal which one it was. He was transfigured whatever mountain he was on. Make sense? So here's what happens in the transfiguration. Let's look at verses 1 to 3. Who does he take with him? Peter, James, and John. That's the inner circle. That doesn't mean they were more important disciples, but there were disciples he was closer to than others, and of those three, there was one he was closer to than the other two. Nothing wrong with that. But be that as it may, he takes this inner circle of Peter, James, and John and goes on this high mountain, and he's transfigured. What does the word transfigured mean? He was changed. Now, the parallel accounts do not use the word transfigured. That it gives the idea that there was this change, but it doesn't use the word transfigured. I'll leave you to check that out in the interest of time. And his clothes became white as light, and there was Moses and Elijah appeared with him, talking with him. Seemingly, and we'll see some evidence of that over at verse 5, I think, that Moses stands for the law. Moses here is representative of the law. And Elijah was among the first of the prophets, so he's standing at the head of all the prophets. So here are God's spokesman, a great prophet, Moses, great prophet Elijah, the law, and the prophets, pretty much the sum of the Old Testament. Does that make sense? Now, the disciples recognized them. Notice at verse 4, Peter's proposal. He jumps out with this proposal. Let's build a tabernacle, 3 tabernacles, 1 for each of you. How did they know it was Moses and Elijah? We're not told. Maybe from the conversation. You would pick up on that. I don't know. But they recognized this being Moses and Elijah. Now then, notice that Peter is not immediately rebuked there. Doesn't need it because of what's about to happen. At verse 6, there's a cloud moves in and overshadows them. And then what happens? There's a voice from heaven, the Father of heaven, speaks and said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. Hear him." Now, if you're apt to forget this, make a marginal note right here, be good. That shows that Jesus is superior to the law, and he's superior to the prophets. He's superior to Moses and to Elijah. So the Jews said, we go back to the law. We go back to what the prophets had to say. We believe in the Old Testament. Jesus, this is the whole argument of the book of Hebrews. He's superior to the law and he's superior to the prophets. So when all was over, Jesus comes to them, they're greatly afraid, and tells them to rise up, and they lifted up their eyes, and who'd they see? No one but Jesus. Doesn't mean Moses is not important. Doesn't mean Elijah is not important. This is my son. They were not the son of God. This is my son. Moses, great man, but not the son of God. Elijah, great man, but not the son of God. This is the son. So, that is God's testimony. More about that in a moment if we have time. Now, they come down off the mountain, and the statement is made at verse 9. What's in this discussion? Don't tell anyone. Now, why? He doesn't tell. Again, it may be in the context of there was an effort to try to seize and make him king. The people are not ready. Full declaration is not, we're not ready for a full declaration yet. That's going to be made. But notice what he said. Don't tell that until he's risen from the dead. That's the point. Full declaration is ready. Does that make sense? Don't tell till that's all done. Now there's a question about Elijah. Why would a question about Elijah come up? Because they have just seen Elijah. Yeah, they've just seen Elijah. And there was prophecy concerning the coming of Elijah, and the Jews talked about Elijah would come. The scribes said Elijah would come. Why did they say that? Well, you might make a marginal note if you don't have it somewhere. Luke 1:17. John the Baptist came in the spirit and the power of Elijah. Now, Jesus said Elijah is coming, and he has come. And they understood when he got through talking. I take this not to be the full declaration of his conversation, but a summary. So when Jesus got through with his explanation, they understood he was talking about John the Baptist. Notice what he says about John, because this fits with his transition and his focus. What did they do to John? They killed him. They did whatever they wanted to. And he said also, they're going to do same to me. See his focus? He's changed his focus toward Jerusalem. Transition has taken place. All right, now let's talk about the healing of the epileptic son. Now, when Jesus came down off the mountain, this account doesn't tell us, but the parallel accounts say there was this discussion and commotion going on, and what's going on? He knew, but he asked what's going on, and there was this man who had this epileptic son, said, I had this boy that needs to be healed, and brought him to your disciples, and they failed. Now, let's get three things that happened here. This man brought his epileptic son to Jesus for healing, but then he points out in 16 and 17 and 19 to 21, I brought him to your disciples, and they couldn't do anything. They couldn't do it. They failed. Now, the parallel account in Mark says that his wording to Jesus was, if you can do anything. Why would he doubt? Well, the disciples' failure would create a little doubt. If you can, ask him to heal him. And Jesus said, if you believe. Now, this is not recorded in this account, but Jesus said, if you believe, and he said, I believe, then what did the man say? Help my unbelief. Remember that? That's this man. Mark tells us that story in Mark 9, 24 to 29. So the disciples asked, why couldn't we cast him out? And what was Jesus' answer? Because of your lack of faith. Now let's make a couple of notes here. Look at verse 29, because of your unbelief. The miracle failed, not because of a lack of faith of the recipient of the miracle, but the lack of faith of the performer of the miracle. Now contrast that with modern day so-called miracle workers who you ask them to work a miracle and, well, we can't do that because you don't believe. The disciples were rebuked saying, you couldn't do it because you didn't believe. The Lord put it on a different level. So he told them if they had faith, they could do this. And I notice at verse 21, I'm more interested in verse 21. However, this kind tells me a couple of things. One, that there are varying kinds of demons. In other words, here's a demon, and here's a demon in New Testament times. They were not all the same, with varying strengths. You say, explain more. I've told you the limit of my knowledge of demons. I don't know anymore. Maybe there's more to be that is revealed that I don't remember. But my point is, I can't tell you anymore about what those, but it seems to be Jesus is implying there are different kinds of demons and there are different strengths. This particular kind, very strong demon apparently, does not go out except by prayer and fasting. Now, what is he talking about? Well, Linsky suggests, I think he's talking about focus on their part. You're not focused and had the degree of faith. Perhaps they thought we could just work a miracle, and you've got to have true faith as my disciple. Linsky suggests that faith must be stimulated by prayer and fasting. And as your faith gets stronger, you can work this miracle. Poole suggests that there are some things that are obtained by stronger faith. Well, that harmonizes with Luke 17, of course. And I'll leave that there. Let's go now and talk about the third thing that happens. Jesus foretells of his death and the resurrection. You see that transition? See what's on his mind? This is the third time in these two chapters he's talked about, I'm going to Jerusalem. Third time. Going to be killed. So you might make a marginal note at verse 22, back to 16 and 21, that he's going to go to Jerusalem and he's going to and be killed and the third day be raised. And they were exceedingly sorrowful. Might underline sorrowful there. Let's get ahead of ourselves. Get ahead of ourselves. You might make a marginal note and connect that down to chapter 18 in verse 1. That sorrow Didn't last very long because it's not long till they turn their attention to themselves. We'll flag that again next week. But that's interesting. You say you're going to die. Oh, we're just sorrowful, sorrowful. Next thing you know, they're arguing over who's the greatest. That didn't last long. That didn't last long at all. Now let's get the last thing, and hopefully we can squeeze in one more thing. What happens in 24 to 27? They came to Capernaum, right? Here's where Capernaum is. They're in the northern part, right here. Come to Capernaum. Now, what happens at Capernaum? They were asked, the disciples were asked about a temple tax, probably alluding to Exodus 30 and in verse 13. Though you go there, and then what they were charging had changed. Big surprise. The Jews would change some of the law. But be that as it may, here's the discussion. Does your master pay the temple tax? Oh yeah, he pays the temple tax. And so Peter goes into the house, and Jesus anticipating it. Well, what's on your mind, Peter? Well, the discussion basically goes, Peter, who pays the tax? Is it the stranger, the foreigner, or is it the family and the local people? Well, unlike our tax, where we tax, for example, in Tennessee, our people here, but foreigners who come in, they're not taxed. If they reside here, but we're not taxing someone somewhere else. And the people who are of royalty or part of the leadership are not supposed to be exempt in our country. But the practice was that you didn't tax that you did tax the foreigner in biblical times, and for example, the royal family would be exempt from that. So here's the point. Jesus is actually making an affirmation for his deity. And Peter made this answer, it's the strangers that are taxed. And Jesus said, then the sons are free. In other words, exempt. Meaning I'm exempt. If this is a tax for the temple of God, I am the Son of God, I am a son. It's an affirmation of his deity, really. So that makes me exempt. Nevertheless, we'll pay it anyway. And then he tells him to go cast a hook. And what's he going to find? Going to find a coin in the mouth. That's strange. You don't find coins in them. And not only going to find the coin, it's the exact coinage that would pay the tax for two. For Jesus and for Peter. That's interesting. Further confirmation to Peter and any other disciple as Peter tells him, you know what? I went and I found, and that the first fish I brought out had exact coinage. To find any coin there would be amazing, but the exact coin to pay for two only could be done by a miracle. Make sense? Now, I know we're kind of rushed for time, but let's get this quickly. This is what we saw in these chapters. We're focusing on the reaction to Jesus. The Pharisees ignored and rejected. The disciples were slow. They didn't catch on right quick. We see that in chapter 16, chapter 17. They did accept him being the Son of God, but they're a little shallow. That thread we just mentioned a moment ago, their sorrow quickly turned to their focus on themselves. So the disciples are kind of wishy-washy at times. They got it. They understand who he is. They're a little slow catching on, and yet at times their faith is a little shallow. The world, well, they're confused and not ready to accept it all. The Father said, he's my Son. Isn't that interesting? Fascinating to me. Questions or comments? Time is gone. Chapter 18 next time.